Hey, and welcome to our last session in our Facebook series, or our series on the allegations against Facebook that we created sort of last minute in an effort to address the allegations that have been made by Frances Hagen, who used to work as a data analyst for Facebook. She has testified now before the United States Congress as well as the British Parliament. And she has also produced tens of thousands of documents in order to support her allegations against Facebook. And these are allegations that, as far as I can tell, are still sort of coming out because they are being unpacked by, the various people who have access to these documents. And so more and more of the problems involved might be evident as we go forward. And so one thing that we were thinking in terms of the Humanities Center was to continue the series in person in the spring, and try to address more aspects of the social media platforms that have been leading to all of these various issues. Issues of free speech, issues of how they've impacted us politically. We have an election year coming up. And so all of these things that are really on people's minds about how Facebook and their lack of self-regulation, their lack of transparency has been leading us more into the weeds as a nation, so to speak. So again, I am Dr. Susie Babka. I am a faculty member in the Theology and Religious Studies Department, and I am the Technology and Humanities Chair of the Humanities Center. And so my role is to try to get us in the humanities to examine more and more of these questions about the use of technology in our lives as human beings, whether it's AI or social media. So today we are really honored to have with us two professors from USD's law school. The first that will speak is Professor Orly Lobel, who is the Warren Distinguished Professor of Law at the law school. She has clerked for the Israeli Supreme Court and has degrees from Harvard and Tel Aviv University. Her professional experience is pretty extensive in terms of teaching at Yale, as a fellow at Harvard for the Center of Ethics, the Kennedy School of Government. She has a long list of honors. Her scholarly work is very interesting. I've been looking through it. One of the things I was interested in was the book on the intellectual property question in Mattel with the Barbie problem. I thought that looked like a really interesting read. So I just wanted to recommend that book, as well as all of your other publications in various aspects of legal issues regarding labor, regarding employment, regarding intellectual property rights. Our second speaker is Professor David McGowan, who is the Lyle L. Jones Professor of Competition and Innovation Law and the Director of the Center for Intellectual Property Law and Markets. Professor McGowan has degrees from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as the University of California, Los Angeles. His areas of expertise are professional responsibility, the relationship between law and technology, legal ethics. He's also clerked for judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals. He has practiced law in several locations in California and has taught at USD since 2005. So Professor McGowan, if you'd like to, Professor Lobel, if you'd like to start us, and then Professor McGowan, and I'll just put myself on mute. So thank you both.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babka. I have to say that I'm just really thrilled to be doing more and more across the campus collaborations and teaching and cooperation. So I'm getting to know Hannah Haltzman, who's on the call, and Maritza Johnson, who is her collaborator, and they have been co-teaching something really interesting and related to what we're talking about today. And I see Jessica Heldman from our law school who does child protection. And we were just on a call last week talking about the implications of Facebook and child children welfare and child well-being and what can be done on that. And the Humanities Center is just a wonderful resource. Actually, when my book, You Don't Own Me, about Barbie and Bratz came out, the Humanities Center organized a really nice book talk there. So I'm really always looking for these university-wide possibilities and talks and collaborations. And I'll just mention another thing is that I'm writing a new book that is very much related to what we're talking about today, which is about the risks and potential of digital platforms and algorithms and automation, and thinking about well-being, equality, equity. So I have a few kind of issues that I'll highlight in regard to what's going on right now with Facebook. And a lot of it is more opening up questions rather than, conclusive recommendations or solutions. The first thing that I'll mention is the role of whistleblowing in society. And this is something that I've thought about quite a bit. I teach employment law and whistleblower protections. And what we're really seeing is the significance in our kind of newer industries and tech industries, just like in the past, where whistleblowers and kind of insiders that had access when there wasn't transparency, when there wasn't kind of light and accountability on what's going on in, with dominant actors in various industries, they've always played a really significant role. And I even have a paper that is an empirical paper with my collaborator, who's a social psychologist and a law professor in Israel, where we find gender differences in the willingness of employees to become whistleblowers and be kind of proactive socially and, other looking, other than just kind of keeping their job. We find that we see anecdotally with, there was a few years ago, Times Magazine actually had the 3 People of the Year, and with the big title on the cover of Time Magazine, the Whistleblowers, and they were all women. And I show that slide to my students and I say, anecdotally and also experimentally and empirically, there is some evidence there. So it's something to think about, when the tech industry is very much male dominant, it's not diverse. Silicon Valley has a white male problem, which is very well reported. And then you see a young woman becoming this whistleblower and starting, and I think a colleague of hers is also testifying, and she's also female. So I thought that was interesting. Related to that, and a second point in what I mentioned about kind of this is a moment for the tech industry, there's a lot of thinking about those patterns of industries that were relatively new at the time, or were doing new things, and we didn't know much about them. And they had internal research about their own, impact. And when we knew more about it, it led to more agency involvement, more government regulation. And so there are these parallels when we think about the tobacco industry, when we think about the asbestos industry, when we think about the smoking guns that we found in internal memos in the car safety industry, when we think about the food industry. All of those had their moments, and I think this is a moment for tech about thinking, of what is their impact, what is happening, and what can be done. Then the third point is really related, again, builds on the second point of what can be done. Dr. Babka said, Facebook didn't self-regulate, hasn't been self-regulating well, how can we do it? And we're we're the two law professors in this series, so we certainly need to think about that. I will say that one really interesting thing that happened immediately post the exposure and the congressional hearings was a statement by Zuckerberg saying, "Please regulate us." And you can be cynical about that. You can say this is just a response that like he thinks that we want to hear. But from my experience and from my research and also from talking to a lot, I've been on panels now with a lot of dominant platforms in their industry. So there's we have social media, but we have online dual-sided marketplaces in all sorts of industries. From Uber and Lyft to Fiverr and Upwork to Airbnb and other that in every single industry we're seeing these changes and innovation that is happening in how offline commerce is being done and communication, and it's done by these platforms, and there is this inevitable lag or kind of catching up that law and policy have to be doing. But I've seen it, and Amazon is a good example. I've seen certainly these calls by the platforms themselves to get a little bit more level playing field, a little bit more regulation. Sometimes it's cynical, sometimes it's a marketing thing, sometimes it's a strategic assessment that because you are the dominant, powerful platform in the space, you can actually maintain your dominant position because you will be able to adjust to these regulations much better than any new entry and small competitor. But honestly, I think that it's of course a mix of all of those, but I think there is that pillar of a real sense of, what, we haven't been not self-regulating. And when you look at Facebook, they actually have been self-regulating. Like they, maybe they haven't done, not maybe, for sure they haven't done a perfect job. For sure they haven't done, everything that they could do. But they have an enormous number of, content moderators and so much invested in their trust and safety, ethics, automation of moderation and human moderation. They just got, a class action by their huge number of content moderators that, they had to pay them for being exposed to all sorts of content. And I think that, Marissa Johnson, who I mentioned before, was saying, no engineer joins, you might separate between the very, very top people, but like no engineer joins Google or Facebook saying, oh, I'm going to destroy democracy today. Like that's not, I truly believe, again, being an employment scholar, like most businesses and most employees want to do well, but want to also do the right thing and good stuff. And these are really smart people and mostly ethical people that are working in these various departments, and it's really tough. So, and this is maybe a fourth point here. This is something that I wrote about quite a bit. I have articles about platform regulation. It is really tough because we're seeing the same kind of clashes that we've always had normatively and in a democratic society between different values that we value all of them. So Dr. Bach mentioned free speech. We have speech, we have privacy rights, we want security, we want competitiveness, we want competition, we want equality and equity, and you can't get everything all the time, at the same time. And so there's real decisions that have to be made, and drawing lines is a tough thing that, all of us legal scholars for sure, but, the humanities also are, and the Centers for Ethics, and everybody's trying to figure these things out. So it's something that is a role for, our public alongside our private industries to do more these sides. And so how do you do it? This will be my last point. So it is true that there's been something of a vacuum and something of an immunity and a purposeful immunity that comes, of course, from the notorious Section 230 of the Communications Act, where platforms, it's kind of what built the internet, platforms are not liable for user-generated content. So that is all kind of with that lens of free speech, and there's a lot of good that has come from that, but we're seeing more and more that it's problematic. So there have been a lot of exceptions that have been carved out. It's also quite an American kind of point of view of the primacy of free speech and the First Amendment versus other maybe normative values that we care about as well. And I think the EU has been playing a greater role in thinking about regulating platforms, a faster role. But even within, this user content immunity, we still, we can draw those lines and think about platform accountability. For example, with Facebook, what's coming out is very much kind of this question of what does the algorithm prioritize? What do we actually see first and more often? And that, I think, there could be a good case to say that's not user-generated content, and that in itself can be regulated in some way. And there's different ways that we regulate. It's, I'm a regulatory scholar. I think about, things, the costs and benefits and trade-offs between regulating in the way of having more transparency and accountability and kind of best practices and knowing what's happening, or straightforward command and control, like this is how you always regulate. And it's hard. Again, it's very hard, but for sure we're not even in the kind of anywhere in that spectrum of, we need to know more about how these automated platforms are happening. And so we need more data accountability. Again, I think the EU and also California are doing more on that. And we can talk about it more when we open things up. But the final thing is the kind of other big part of the law here that this is how I'm kind of giving it over to Dave, is the antitrust part of it. So these are for a lot of different reasons. And again, I've written an article with Ken Bamberger up at Berkeley that's called Platform Market Power. For various reasons, anti-competitiveness is happening in a different way now that we're in the data world, in the digital world, than it used to. So you can see in all of these different industries that I've mentioned, social media, search engines, service disruptors, that they reach these dominant positions and they become the category kings. And there's a lot of smart people that are trying to figure out, why and how, but it has to do with data and the ownership of data and what you can do with the data. And all of them are really data companies. And so I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of smart people that Biden added to his administration on the antitrust competition, at the head of the FTC now, who wrote this seminal article on Amazon's antitrust paradox, and Tim Wu, who's Biden's advisor now on competition, thinking about, not the way that we used to think about trust, like just break them up or something like that, but thinking about, how to share data, how to make it accessible is something that relates to antitrust. And I'll give it to Dave at this point to say more about that, because he's an antitrust scholar.
Let me ask people, I'm going to do the layers principle of regulation, and I'll talk about in concrete terms, some of the trade-offs that Orly mentioned. And then I'll talk a little bit about the prospect of competition policy. The way you want to think about the specific trade-offs that are on the table is to think of the internet as a layer cake. The bottom of the layer you want to think of as power plants, and electricity. And their distinguishing characteristic is going to be that they're utilities. And in the law, utility regulation is a very specific set of things. Prices are set by public utilities commissions. Whether the cost of decommissioning San Onofre is paid by you or the investors of SDG&E is a PUC question. Whether utilities can pass on surge pricing increases, whether such as in the Midwest when I started teaching at Minnesota, there were mandatory rules that your power couldn't be cut off in January, even if you weren't paying your bill, because if your heating is cut off in January in Minnesota, it goes badly. So PUC regulation, utility regulation, is a very intrusive way the government can essentially tell a business what you're going to charge, who you have to serve. None of what we're talking about at present is subject to utility regulation. Next layer of the cake, I'm going to call the TCP/IP layer, broadband cellular infrastructure, Cox communication. Right now, they are regulated as common carriers. Common carriers means the following. You take all traffic, you can't turn any down. The big policy debate there is something called net neutrality. Net neutrality is the question whether all packets have to be treated equally, or whether Netflix can pay Cox to preference Netflix flows so they go faster. The thing the common carrier folks, the Cox folks, don't want is to be regulated as utilities, because then it's price setting. And it costs a lot of money to roll out pipes. And what your rate of return is, how you get investment in the first place, depends on the model that you're allowed to use to promise your investors a return. The top layer is the one we've been talking about. I'll call that the content layer. Facebook, Instagram, whatever website you want to use. Right now, platforms, as Professor Lobel was talking about, are not regulated as common carriers. One big choice on the table in American politics right now is whether they should be regulated as common carriers. If they were regulated as common carriers, what that means is they would not be liable for content, because if you call up somebody and do some illegal transaction on your cell phone, Verizon is not liable for what you do. If you defame somebody, Verizon is not liable for what you do. January 6th is being blamed on Facebook to some extent. Nobody's blaming it on Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint. We all think of them as passive conduits. So Facebook, the platforms, don't want to be common carriers because, as Professor Lobel was saying, they actually regulate quite a lot of content. They try to have, in a broad sense, a certain trade-off between participation and some meager degree of decorum, civility, whatever you want to call it. Right now, as a private company, it's not state action. They can do whatever they want, the same way the New York Times can do whatever it wants, Fox News can do whatever it wants. If they were to be treated as a common carrier, and this would be coming mostly from the right, then everything Ms. Hagen talks about would get worse. But nobody would have to worry about Facebook imposing its political views on anybody else, because all the pornography, all the lies, all whatever you don't like in the world, they would be required to carry. That's a fundamental policy decision. It's a big one. And right now, when I see the right and the left uniting in their hatred of social media companies, I look at it and I say, I wonder if you folks have really thought this through. Because common carrier treatment would solve one set of problems and greatly magnify another. In the content layer, the top layer of the cake, authors of Facebook posts, the people who write them, are liable for unlawful content, full stop. You defame somebody, you write a true threat, which would be unusual in a one-to-many broadcast, you're liable. What Section 230 does is say that Facebook is not the publisher, as long as it does not contribute materially to the post. You edit the post, you create a template that forces the content in the post, you lose Section 230 liability. That has wrought the democratization of speech in this country. When I grew up, there were 3 networks licensed by the federal government and a fairness doctrine that required people to respond. That was a high fixed cost, low participation model. What Section 230 facilitates, to be clear in very precise terms, is a low incremental cost. It's a high fixed cost for the platforms, a low incremental cost of expression. That's facilitated by the cell phones that capture police beatings. You never would have seen that in the 70s. And even if people had phones, they would have been funneled through 3 networks, licensed by the federal government. So that's the world we give up for the world that we have. In the current environment, there's a lot of content that is protected speech. And I'll go to Ms. Hagen's whistleblowing for a second. Part of it has to do with what is referenced as anorexia content. I'm not sure what that is. If it's pictures, images of people with highly idealized, non-standard, unrealistic body types, models and magazines, there's no way, consistent with the First Amendment of the United States, you're going to stop that. Political opinion, non-defamatory political opinion, hyperbole, it's lawful speech. So the one thing President Trump was exceptionally good at was making statements that sounded factual, but when you really push on them, they're hyperbole. It's walking this defamation line in a very skilled, sort of frightening way. Right now in the content layer, platforms have 2 sources of legal authority to pull down a post. The contract you have with the platform gives them the power. That's the basis of Twitter deplatforming former President Trump. We have a contract. Section 230 allows them to do that as a fallback, but in the first instance, what allows them to do it is the contract. To treat them as common carriers would deprive them of that ability. Ms. Hagen's whistleblowing, and I want to contest a little bit the idea that this is new information. She testified that Facebook knows that its amplification algorithms, things like engagement-based ranking on Instagram, can lead children from very innocuous topics like healthy recipes. And Professor Lobel is right in what she just said in the chat. The allegation that everyone is seeing in the press and is being described as new is that Facebook has Instagram, or it has algorithms that in essence push content. I don't think that's new information. I was going to show you some excerpts from a 2019 Second Circuit opinion in which the allegation was that Facebook was liable because some persons associated with Hamas, oh, can you see this now? Some persons, this is the excerpts of the testimony, so engagement-based ranking. This is a 2019 case from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. The case would have been filed around 2016, if I'm getting my guesses right, 2017. And the allegation was that there is unlawful activity happening on Facebook, which is unquestionably true. When you open yourself to the world, you get a lot of good and a lot of bad. So the question was very specifically, was Facebook the publisher under Section 230 by virtue of its use of algorithms in order to prioritize content? Now, this is 2019. You can find this on the internet anywhere. The fact of algorithm use is not itself new. The details of an algorithm at any given point in time may be, but the fact that platforms are trying to construct a feed to keep people's eyes riveted to the platform is what caused, Professor Lobel mentioned Tim Wu. Tim wrote a book in 2016 called The Attention Merchants. It was a premise of that book. That's on my recommended reading list, which I'll give you in a minute. So I don't consider that to be something that is new if you've spent a lot of time looking at these problems. If you're reading the 10Ks, if you're doing that kind of stuff. It may be new broadly construed. And that I don't have a strong view of. It depends on where people come into this conversation. The question then is, what would you do? And the recommendation that was given in Ms. Hawkins' testimony, the one that I saw, although there may be many, I haven't read all of it, was instead of doing something that was based on your past history of liking, your use of emoticons, the amount of time you spent on a particular post, a content analysis of that post or video in relation to a content analysis of another one, you could just do it chronologically. The thing at the top of your news feed is always the thing that came in most recently. So if you have a crazy aunt or uncle who posts all the time, you see a lot of them. I don't know if it would be consistent. I assume it would be consistent to rank posts by language so that you could prioritize English as opposed to something else. The Second Circuit said in that case that the use of an algorithm to prioritize content does not make Facebook a publisher. I think that's a defensible conclusion, though not a certain one. It's certainly shaping content that you see. And the question is, what is the premise it's shaping on? The premise it's shaping on tends to be the observed behavior of the user, meaning if all you ever want is Disney stuff, you will get more Disney stuff. So it's feeding you back what it thinks you like to eat to keep you riveted to the site so it can make more money by selling your attention. If we want to change that, an interesting free speech question is raised, which is the degree to which you can regulate based on the assumption that people are getting too much of something. I have never heard anyone describe a political view they like as a rabbit hole. Rabbit holes are always something the other side falls into. Whether it's my conservative friends saying my liberal friends are in a climate change rabbit hole, or my liberal friends saying my conservative friends are in a QAnon rabbit hole, it's a pejorative. I don't find it helpful. The free speech issues there are very complex because in general, the free speech tradition in the United States is, it's the obligation of the reader or listener to deal with their conduct in response to expression. It's not the obligation of the speaker to mind the behavior of the listeners. And that may not be right. That is our tradition, but there's nothing that says prologue, past must be prologue. And in the past, the cases we have that address this topic are things like video games. Well, video games are interactive. I do believe there is such a thing as video game addiction. It's real. The Supreme Court seems not to care. If you're addicted to content, the Supreme Court seems to think the answer is not adjusting the content or making an impediment to the content. I think that's up in the air, but that's the trade-off. Two quick things to end on the regulatory side. I looked at one of the studies, and I'll give you, this is my recommended reading list. Everyone on campus can get the Wall Street Journal reporting. This is an interesting case of whistleblowing. It was coordinated as a Sarbanes-Oxley disclosure to the SEC in order to try and get immunity because it was using documents that didn't belong to the whistleblower, and you tried to get immunity from any legal consequences by going first to the SEC with what seems to have been some sort of deal with Wall Street Journal. I'm not sure on the details, but in Sally, you can get the Wall Street Journal through ProQuest and you can read them yourselves. I've seen one of the studies that Ms. Hagen released. It was on anorexia content. And it was a study conducted by Facebook people. It was a 150-person sample size. And it was a 17%, the finding was that 17% of the persons studied had a greater problem. I couldn't tell if it was a greater problem or at least a problem with their perception of their physical appearance. You could look at that and say that's almost a fifth of users. That's a big number. That's a problem. You could look at that and say 80% of people don't have this problem, and we're not going to temper speech for the 80% because of the 20. Typically, that's where the First Amendment tradition has gone. I don't know that that's where it has to go. But whether the subpopulation governs or whether the dominant population governs is, I think, the precise policy question. You could break Facebook up into 20 little Facebooks, and I don't think any of this would change, because the reason they're doing this is they make more money that way. And if you have 20 of them and they're all maximizing profits, then they're all going to do it the way that makes the most profit. I think the thing that they are really worried about is if Section 230 gets modified, what the finance people want is certainty. And it was interesting, the analogy Professor Lobel did to cigarettes. What the cigarette companies did was cut a deal on advertising. In exchange for a mandatory label, they got immunity from basically a large class of advertising suits. And the reason you had so many cases alleging marketing to children was that was a carve-out. But if you had a deal where you had one rule for Facebook to follow, then I think they would probably be happy, not because they like the rule or not, but because the alternative is going to be individual lawsuits in 300 district courts around the country, and that they really don't want. So it could be that profit maximization and simplicity dovetail there. And then the question is, what exactly is this rule going to say?
Thank you both so much. This was fascinating. I have all these pages of notes, and I'm sure that I have plenty of questions myself, but I want to open it up to the rest of the attendees. If anyone has a question, you can either raise your hand, you can put it in the chat, or simply unmute yourself and just ask. We have a low enough amount that it's fine to go ahead and just unmute and ask the question. So any questions at all for our speakers?
I'll just, if I can pop in. Yeah, thank you both so much. It was really, yeah, very fascinating, sort of coming at this from a direction that I know very little about. And I'm just very curious about Professor McGowan, what you were saying about that Frances Hagan's whistleblowing wasn't really news, right? And I'm wondering what your opinion is on why it's gotten so much traction then, when she's not even the first whistleblower, right? We've had a whistleblower earlier this year as well. And if these legal concerns are really Facebook's top concern right now, because it seems like another concern for them really seems to be the loss of their younger audience, right? This kind of shift to the meta.
Yeah.
So.
On the first point, I think there is a political moment right now where both the right and the left hate Silicon Valley. So it's an auspicious time for it. I don't know for the population at large if they're aware. So if you read Tim Wu's book when it came out, you would know. If you were reading the court cases that were using algorithms as a predicate for saying Facebook shouldn't receive Section 230 immunity, you would know. That's not everybody. And people have better things to do than worry about what the algorithms are in their social media platform. It's not something they're really expected to know. You know, it seems to me a kind of orchestrated campaign. The Wall Street Journal gets an exclusive period of time for a rollout. Now it's going broader. There's nothing wrong with that. 60 Minutes and all the rest of it. And it may be that there's an iteration of algorithm that is different from the push algorithms you were getting in the past. I haven't seen evidence of that, but you know, for a long time, people knew cigarettes cause cancer. And then there was a moment in the mid-90s when the political stars aligned, and all of a sudden people threw their hands up in the air and said, oh my gosh, the tobacco companies knew that cigarettes cause cancer and they didn't tell us. And everybody pretended to be outraged. And maybe some people were. And there was a lot of money passed from tobacco companies to state attorneys general in suits brought by states. You know, it could be that people were genuinely offended that tobacco companies knew, even when the Surgeon General had been putting the label on the cigarettes for years and years and years. I can't really say as to why it's getting the play that it's getting. I do feel that the fact of the algorithm was not something that was previously unknown. I think the fact that Facebook, this is a company that has almost 90,000 employees, the fact that some of them disagree doesn't surprise me. But I think it is, in a strange way, you're kind of like watching a family squabble, because there are people inside Facebook getting angry at each other. And it's almost like a reality TV slice of, look, these people are arguing among themselves. They're really mad. I can't give you a sociological explanation for it. I can just say, I think that one slice, you can look at things that were published a while ago that did talk about.
I mean, I can jump in too. So I agree with this, and I think first of all, the fact that it's so many documents and that they're internal and they show, direct knowledge is maybe more new. Facebook has been, getting more and more on the radar just by sheer size. It really is the greatest. If it was a country, it would be the greatest country in the world. It has more citizens than anybody else. But your question, Hannah, was also, well, maybe they're actually stagnating now, and they are. Their growth is stagnating, and they have, on the TikTok side, they have these competitors that are coming from somewhere else, and again, this comes to kind of the question of what can be done. However imperfect a company like Facebook or Google has been, it's probably more transparent and doing more than some other than I assume TikTok. We know much less about TikTok, and it has a much higher growth rate in the past 2 years than what Facebook has been seeing. So I've been saying this. I actually had some debates about this with other colleagues, and I've been on, these "what about Facebook" panels in the past few weeks. I think that, it's very important that we don't make it all about Facebook. Algorithmic decision making is something that's happening everywhere for every type of decision making, public and private, in every industry and every online platform, and also like big, offline player is becoming an online platform as well. So we want to think about. I want to make sure that for all of us that we remember not to just make it about Facebook, and we want to think about what everybody's doing and kind of straightening some line on what needs to be done. I'm seeing some questions. I don't know if you want me to look at those, but they're related. I see one of the, maybe a couple of them.
On minors.
On children, right? Jessica is a leader in our school on children welfare and protection, and this might be also, actually, this might actually be responsive also to what Hannah was asking, like what's different, what's new. You're right that we knew a lot of things that were happening. We've been having all these questions about algorithmic accountability, automating inequality, all these pretty alarmist debates. Actually, my book is responding to that and saying, also don't lose sight of all the good, that is actually happening. The, digital technology being a great equalizer and access to, education and commerce all around the world. There's lots of good that comes out of it. You have to think in a more nuanced and balanced way. But, there was like a month ago, some of the people on this call, I'm sure Hannah Holtzman and others know about the Timnit Gebru kind of whistleblower or kind of ousting at Google, and other people that left Google as a result of saying Google's not doing enough on the equity, equality in their algorithm, is too big to monitor, and nobody knows what's happening and how it's creating inequities. And it didn't get as much attention, even though they were insiders. I think that it's telling that in the, again, press release that Zuckerberg issued, there's so many issues that came out from the current documents, including, like election corruption, security issues, terrorism, financial fraud, like all these issues that are important. But the one that Zuckerberg said in the letter, like that is really the most painful to him, is it's about the children, right? So that can be, that makes people more emotional and more concerned than any other thing that seems maybe more politicized. And I think that also, that was my response to Dave. I think that also our laws historically have been more comfortable with, some, lines that are drawn, or some safeguards that may be in tension with speech and freedoms, market freedoms, when it comes to child protection. So we already have, just to make it clear, we do have COPA, the Children Privacy Act. What?
Yes, go
I
ahead.
can't remember the acronym. We also have on the side of, not just about children, President Trump signed into law SESTA and FOSTA that put some, exceptions on Section 230 on the sex trafficking issues. So it's not like we don't have precedents for this, but I think that, when it comes to children, there's just a lot of mobilization around what can be done.
One thing I would do is distinguish between conduct regulations. You can certainly prevent children from getting on Facebook just by passing a law that says children, they have free speech rights, but they're attenuated. What I don't think you can do is regulate content that is otherwise lawful on the ground that it might induce children in particular to do bad things. That was tried as the basis for violent video game regulation. I put in the chat a case, it's a little old now, it's 10 years is a long time. You can, and the tobacco industry has had a lot of trouble with this. If you can restrict people from consuming a product, you can restrict advertising to those people for that product. So if you can say you can't smoke till you're 18, then you can make it problematic to advertise to kids. But it depends on, so I agree with, there are a lot of things you can do with respect to keeping kids offline, or if you're targeting kids. I am just not entirely sure what the anorexia content referred to. If it referred to posts for fake drugs that were misrepresenting the content of something, easy case, that's fraud. That could be an FDA violation. If they're referring to people doing promos for some crazy diet, ooh, that's tougher. And I don't know what has particular valence for children. If it's so, and that's why it's hard to draft a rule that covers all of the cases you're going to come into. You can draft some category prohibitions, or you can use the other thing people like to do, and this is very much consistent with what Orly was saying, you just import a strong knowledge requirement, then you can do a lot of stuff. Backpage.com, which some people may have heard of, was a big criminal indictment for child sex trafficking, and they tried a Section 230 defense. And if you know that you are facilitating criminal behavior, you are not going to have a great day in court with a 230 argument. The basis of the argument is that you've got, YouTube 3 years ago, the statistic was 500 hours of content every minute of every day 365 days a year. That was what was added to YouTube. So you're never going to filter that ex ante. And you just have to make a choice. Do you want to let it out and then claw it back? And Orly brought up another very good point. I've worked with some of these folks. A lot of stuff never gets out, but there's only so much algorithms can do. So there are human beings looking at things like kitten crush videos as their job. And that's, wow, right? That's the, I mean, I can't even imagine doing that for your job. I'm glad people are doing it, but gosh. And I just think, how do you get at these people uploading this stuff? I really want to find them. And the answer is they seem to be everywhere. There was a reference to pornography. Pornography would be distinguished from obscenity. Pornography is lawful. Obscenity is not. And the difference
No,
between
but
the two is
child pornography is not lawful. Yeah.
yeah, child pornography is not lawful. That's use of children, images of children clearly under
Right.
20, under 18. An image of someone who is young looking, like in the movie Traffic, in
Is
which
lawful.
the character was portrayed as underage, is completely lawful.
It's completely lawful. I would just, for a lot of things that you're saying as like presenting the law, I have to say, the law is something that's being shaped and dynamic, and we have a certain composition right now, and with our current court, it doesn't mean that it's lawful everywhere. France, for example, has a very different, like actually much more stringent protection on children than we do, and this is what my reaction also to some of what you, Dave, you were saying, kind of like, oh, we know that this is the scope of our constitutional laws. So selling the product is not, unlawful, but maybe the advertising to children would be something that would be limited. I would say, we have to also remember that we're dealing with very new forums that have very new effects on our brains, and definitely on our undeveloped brains when we're minors. And it should lend itself to a greater conversation about, how do we shape, the next frontiers of constitutional law. We shouldn't just accept that, like, the ways that we've thought about it, like, ads is one thing, and then the access to product is another thing. The product itself, actually, I would emphasize this, is the product of the algorithmic, design on the platform and how we're seeing, and we are the product. That's kind of the saying that goes, right? Like, if we're not paying for the product, we are the product. We are the product, and so that, I think there is a role, and there will be a role for the Federal Trade Commission and studying this more, and it will involve psychologists, and ethicists, along with legal scholars and engineers. So, it's what we've had in the past is informative, but it's certainly not, the last thing that we need to think about, or the only.
Yeah, I agree with that. To me, abstractions don't help on these topics. As soon as I see an actual, so this is what we're going to do, it's going to be chronological, and the federal law will require you to get all of your feeds chronologically. I can now think about that. Do I like that? Do I not like that? I remember, I'm an antitrust person. President Trump set the antitrust division after the state of California and Ford and GM, after GM Ford, for cooperating with the state of California on car mileage regulation. Every time you think about the government regulating something, think about that. Because I'll tell you, as a doctrinal matter, that was absolutely frivolous. It was the most ill-intentioned misuse of government power. He could be president again. So part of this tradition is nobody should have that power, versus somebody I like has that power versus somebody I don't like has that power. And it's I agree, all of these are hard questions. The modern First Amendment has some really bad aspects. It protects falsity. in a lot of cases, when you look at it and you say, wow, isn't lying like a problem? Isn't it a problem in our society that there is so much falsity? And the Supreme Court has this wonderful case that says falsity alone is not a good enough reason. And when I read it, and I still to this day, I think, wow, I think you guys need to get out more. It's just hard to swallow. So I don't mean to say that history is ended. I do mean to say it's hard to come up with a concrete proposal, because then you get into these trade-offs and they're very difficult.
Jessica, you've had your hand up for a while. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I think Orly said a lot of what I was thinking of adding to the conversation. And I think going back to the desire for transparency and better understanding of the products themselves, as a child advocate, I think about, I'm focused on children and their interaction with these platforms and the effect it has. And ultimately, the way it's set up is that parents are expected to monitor the child's involvement on the platform. And therefore, in the name of consumer protection, we need transparency to understand the algorithm and what it's doing to children, and to what extent it's harmful, in what ways it's harmful, so that those charged with the protection of these children in the personal realm can actually make informed decisions about their child's use. And so to me, that with that argument, we're asking for, at the very least, more information about how the algorithm works, and regulations that will facilitate that kind of transparency seem like a really important foundational piece. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, because that really involves a lot of the technical aspects that we need folks who are doing this work to guide us in. But I think that's a primary goal. And then building on that, I think the view of the algorithm itself, as Orly said, as the product, distinguishing that from content itself, not necessarily saying that you can't have a picture of a bikini clad, maybe even some image that was created, by some design mechanism and isn't even human. We're not saying that can't be on the platform. We're saying, does the algorithm create some method by which this is being flashed in front of kids' faces constantly without their knowledge, their parents' knowledge, or even the ability to interrupt that? So I think that's where I think the idea of distinguishing the algorithm as the product from the actual content has to be a really important framing for how we move forward, at least when it comes to children primarily.
That, to me, that's an excellent observation in terms of knowing how the algorithm operates. I think this is where we get back to the public doesn't understand how this works. And I think that getting back to the point about whether people knew that the sort of shenanigans going on at Facebook had been going on is more of a matter of seeing that Facebook knew that their algorithms were, making, more pathways to harm, and yet ignoring that to a large extent. I think that was what Frances Hagan's main point was, in the sense of, can't the government help to create some sort of speed bumps or something in these algorithms to prevent these kinds of pathways? And I think that when it comes to child protection, that these sorts of speed bumps might be really something that we're going to have to consider as a way to slow down the pace of a young girl considering, you know, her body and image and all of these things, and then being led into maybe potentially harmful eating disorder based sites that might give her an even worse self-image and that sort of a thing. And so I think that it sounds to me like there isn't a whole lot that can be done from the standpoint of regulation in terms of content. But maybe if we understood the algorithms better, we would be able to regulate how the algorithms work in terms of getting the wrong people to the content that could be more harmful, especially when we're dealing with minors. Is there anything that you would both want to say to that?
I just wanted to add, you know, Jessica really laid it out in a very compelling way. And I wanted to add another thing about constitutional values that we keep saying children, but it's really showing, the research is showing this disparate impact on girls and young women. And that too, you know, again, we have, that's kind of bringing to the forefront that tension that we have between First Amendment and, you know, just, you know, equal protection. We've always had those tensions, right? There are limits, and I agree that we're facing new territories that we are not yet very knowledgeable about. No single person, and it may well be that really no single person is able to understand and explain algorithms, and so we have to kind of think about the ways that you know, we can have humans in the loop when we're talking about such big data and such sophisticated, automated you know, processes. But again, it's, I just think that we are at this moment that there are things that can be done, and we see this, that the EU passed not only their general directive protection on privacy, but they've amended it since with anything that concerns you as you consumer user that affects you, and it's done by automated decision making by algorithms. The consumers have a right to have it explained and transparent. So I think, again, we have models. These are things that are, you know, we're not alone. The United States is not alone in, you know, having to figure these things out. And even more, I'll loop back to what I started with. It's actually been something that the companies themselves have been trying to figure out too. Like I think they've played a really important and quite commendable role, like in preventing fake news when it comes to COVID, for example. Not preventing, but like, you know, that those decisions that were made by Facebook, by Twitter to, you know, put little tags about, you know, anti-vaxxers saying the vaccine is not working and things like that. That was a good decision that they made on their own. And I think, and I'll bring back Dr. Babka, when she introduced me, she said I'm Israeli and I clerked on the Israeli Supreme Court. I also was, before becoming a law professor, I was a data scientist in the Israeli Defense Forces in the military. So I have like a little bit more, or a different perspective on how do we balance speech and public safety and health and privacy, you know, all these. And so I think it's a moment where, because the companies are so global, because they're so multinational, because they're so dominant, bigger than any other, like any private public agency in their capabilities and knowledge and access to data, and because it's affecting these are common problems that are important to everybody around the world. It is a moment also to kind of get over our like Americanized, very tunnel vision, I think, American idea of what are rights, what are civil liberties, an American, and the old American Constitution versus if you look at like more modern Constitution. So that's a whole spiel I can go down for a long time, but I think it is a moment to keep that in mind.
I'll just say two things. I think on disclosure, it'll be interesting to see if it works. Short of forcing the publication of source code, I think Congress can pretty much subpoena and get, at least at the flowchart level, exactly what the algorithms do. I don't think that information has been absent up until now. I just don't. So you could put on it like a calorie label in the grocery store. You could actually do a little flowchart and make companies put it on the user agreement and say, this is what we do. And it'll get read, I think, just as closely as everything else on the user agreement. But that's not a reason not to try. Maybe it'll matter to some people. What the heck? Why not? That's possible. Might have to iterate it. It's an empirical question whether it would change behavior, but I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, so this is what you get here. I want to end on a harmonious point. I very strongly agree with Orly, and I'm going to translate it one level down to policy. I don't think 230 should be touched, because the only reason Facebook can pull down COVID stuff is that it's not a common carrier. And under a really strange Supreme Court case called United States against Alvarez, it is not a sufficient reason to penalize speech that the speech is false. So right now, what we have in our constitutional system, the people who have the most discretion to try and slow the dissemination of false statements are the people at the distribution chain, precisely because they are not state actors. That's doctrinally where we are. It may not be where France is, that's where we are. And in a common carrier world, every single person saying everything about COVID is on every platform. And that worries me a lot. I like the idea, and there are reasons having to do with the economies of scale of data and information. There are reasons why you tend to get big players in these markets. They have high fixed costs, trivial variable costs. You get the big ones. I think it's a good idea that people who don't like Facebook say that Facebook is no good. I think it'd be an even better idea if they started something of their own. And there are problems in transitioning people off, but if Facebook's not working for people, then ideally somebody will come up with something better. It's not going to be the same. It's not going to be easy to transition, but that's competition. The disclosure point would say that maybe you'll have competition on the basis of algorithms. I think it'll be interesting to see if that proves out. But I am, our free speech tradition, our Constitution is old, our free speech tradition is not. It really develops from the 1920s. I kind of like it. Yeah, no, it's hard to transition costs are positive. It does not follow that
Worked for you, Dave.
It does not follow that regulation is effective. I kind of like it. I really like the idea that anybody with a cell phone standing watching a roadside stop can change the world. That's a profoundly democratic idea. And there's a lot of infrastructure there. So I don't want to lose sight of that, because I think that's wonderful.
I mean, we have facts on who's changing the world, and we have increased wealth gaps, and
I think the people taking a photograph
dream of everybody's changing the world. It's It's sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because even if they can tweet something, it doesn't mean
I think that
we're equal in the attention that we can get, and that's where equality, runs up against this idea of everybody and the American dream of wherever you come from, you're gonna have the same influence. That's not true. But I agree. I'll also end by, I agree with Dave and I agree with myself when I said, like, it's good to have these platforms as part of the solution. I think they are doing things and they have been doing some things well. So it really, it's right now up to us to figure out, what are the trade-offs and allowing some things. And I also think that, Section 230, it is good in general, but we have to understand what it really is doing, what its goal is, and how do we define, what is user-generated content versus what is, decisions that the platforms are actually making, like, algorithmic prioritization and explaining and who owns the data. That's a big one that we didn't mention even. Which is kind of a real thing that, I just wrote an article in the Notre Dame Law Review about it, on how, all of this data should be also open to outside researchers, to academics, to government, so to do a lot of research. So all of this is, as I just think, not within the purview of 230, and there's a lot that can be regulated on that side.
Okay, I think we're going to have to draw our session to a close. Unless anyone has any final questions. This has been really amazing in terms of, for me anyway, trying to understand all of the ramifications of this. I think that if you would consider possibly coming for to speak on your book, Professor Lobel, that you're writing, because it sounds like it's absolutely pertinent to what we're wanting to do in the spring with this session, and perhaps invite Jessica, I know she's left, Jessica Haldeman, to speak on the issue of child welfare when it comes to these platforms and these algorithms. I think that when we're parsing out these issues, just having more of a sense of what the government can do, what can citizens do, what can we demand, what do we value, really helps. So thank you both so much. And we'll just close it there unless anyone has any final thoughts. Thank you.